A Science of Change, podcasting by Gilmore Crosby, social scientist, author, and organization development professional since 1984. Hi, this is Gil Crosby with you again, and today my special guest is experienced OD practitioner Rosa Zubizarreta. And so it's just a privilege to have you here, Rosa. I'm looking forward to the conversation. How are you?
It's a pleasure to be here, Gil. I'm looking forward to the conversation as well.
Cool. Now, we were recently in an online conversation, and you caught my ear by mentioning work you were doing, some kind of group work, at least talking about democracy. So I was excited to start there.
Yeah, sure. So, I am trained as an OD consultant, and that is part of the work I've done in my life. And I became very curious some time ago, around 2006, starting before then, but especially in 2006, when I learned that some people in Austria, some consultants, some public engagement practitioners in Austria were working with a group methodology that I had been trained in as well. But they were applying it not necessarily to organizations and nonprofits and like that, but they were applying it for a public participation context. And what they do is something that's being called these days deliberative mini publics. So it's a cross section of the state or of the city or of the county. It can be a cross section of the whole entire country when you do really big ones called citizens' assemblies. But you can also do them on a smaller scale. And so this cross-sectional group of people, this microcosm, is working on a particular public policy area, coming up with recommendations that are in the public interest.
Cool.
Yeah.
So it's very Lewinian sounding, and as applied to policy, not actually like trying to come up with their own strategy for reducing violence or something, but to influence the government strategy.
Well, exactly. One can do these kinds of mini publics, not sponsored by the government, but potentially sponsored by a nonprofit or sponsored by a network, in which case it would be more for what policies do we ourselves want to implement. The ones that I've studied for my dissertation are ones where, for the most part, they're sponsored by a governing body, again, a city, a state, a county, a national entity, and then the mini public, the microcosm, is coming up with recommendations that it is giving to the governmental sponsors.
Cool. It immediately brings a couple things to mind for me. Mm-hmm. One is that I'm going to be in Vienna in about a month. And so perhaps once we finish the interview, I'd be curious to, possibly meet with some of these practitioners while I'm there. And then the second thing is that the very first project I worked on with my father was to help determine the future of the downtown park in Spokane, Washington, where the Expo 74 had taken place. And so that was a citizens involvement project where we eventually had 10,000 people involved.
Wow. That sounds pretty amazing.
It was, and it was exciting. And in that case, there was some people who were very angry. And so I was just watching and bringing Dad coffee and stuff while I watched him deal with all that. So it was very educational. And I haven't been involved in anything that big that was public since. But I love the idea of application.
So, Gil, I'm curious because I imagine this was in a time before the internet and World Wide Web and all that, and so I'm just curious, how did you involve 10,000 people? Was it in person instead of online?
Well, initially there was 5 groups of maybe 20 each, so 100
Yeah.
people meeting on a fairly regular basis,
Mm-hmm.
and they were designing their own alternative proposal for the future of the park.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so they worked in these 5 groups, and eventually the high tech thing was that we create a slideshow out of that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, cool.
And then a lot of the broader engagement was me riding around Spokane on a bicycle and
Uh-huh.
going to libraries and community centers and schools. And eventually, we had the local television network showing the slide school in high schools, and then the high school students voting. So eventually, we had more than 10,000 people vote on the 5 options.
Oh, so you guys came up with 5 different options, and then you
Yeah.
showed the slides, and then were people able to talk amongst themselves before voting, or was it they just saw the slides and voted, or how was that part set up?
That's more how it happened. They saw the
Uh-huh.
slides and voted. Yeah.
Okay, okay. And were the 5 options very different?
Yes. It went all the way from complete green, no structures, no human built structures in the park, to a theme park, a Disney
Wow.
Six Flags style theme park. And so it was quite the contrast. And it ended up being the center option, which was a mix of
Uh-huh.
like a carousel and some other structures, but mostly just leaving it as a green space.
Wow. And so these 5 groups, they had each come up with a different option, or they had all kind of come up with several, and then you kind of pulled them together to come up with these 5.
The 5 options emerged from dialogue with interested citizens.
Ah.
So, quite heated dialogue.
Uh-huh.
Because
Yes.
Dad got hired because people were angry at the park board, which was run by the city council, because
Uh-huh.
they thought that they were already decided to put in the theme park.
I see. Very
And they,
interesting. Mm-hmm.
yeah, and so they had to have a whole structure there of decision making too. That it was clear that once the 5, even with the voting, that it was still a decision to be made by the park board.
Sure. The voting was input.
Yes, and Dad actually said to the groups that if the park board rejects what you have proposed and what got the most votes, I will help you organize your own like protest or what to do
That's
next.
great. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, and the park board knew that, and the city council knew that, and they were all just relieved to have Dad's help because it was a stalemate up until that moment, and for a long time the citizens. Now I'm doing most of the talking here, but for a long time the citizens were convinced that Dad was simply a stooge of
Right.
the theme park also. And so each meeting would start with maybe 20 or 30 minutes of people taking turns yelling at him.
Yeah.
And then he would listen to each one, and then finally he would say, "Okay, now let's get to work on the 5 themes." Once it had got down to 5 themes, and anyway, he was like Obi-Wan Kenobi up there,
Yep.
managing the anger and not getting reactive to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a very important part of all this, right? One of the when I was doing my research and interviewing facilitators of these processes, 2 of the people that I interviewed uh, were talking about a council that was held in 2015 in the state of Vorarlberg in Austria on the issue of asylum seekers and refugees.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a topic that the state of Vorarlberg had not been very vocal about because they didn't want to get people upset. So, of course, once you bring in people into the room in order to deal with the issue, the first thing that they're going to say is, well, we haven't had enough information, and they're going to be pretty angry and like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's especially when it's a challenging issue. I think that being able to welcome people's emotions and stay steady is key part of the whole thing, because you can't just ask people to turn off their emotions,
No, and they've been bottled up.
and they've been bottled up. Exactly. So working with emotions is definitely a part of the work involved here, for sure.
So, did you go to Austria to do this?
I've been in Austria several times, and
Yeah.
I've met the people who do this. I had not met all of the people who I interviewed. It was more of a snowball interview where I would talk to people and say, "Who do you think I should interview?" and like that. But I did not do the interviews in Austria. I did the interviews on Zoom.
Okay, and you were learning about the process.
Well, I've known about the process, as I said, since 2006. But I was definitely learning a lot more about the process. What I did in terms of my qualitative research is I started out by asking people what they and so who I was interviewing were professional facilitators. They
Mm-hmm.
had to speak some English. They had to be bilingual because I am not fluent in German. But I did also work up with a backup translator, so translator interpreter. So we had some help for when people weren't able to say something in English, etc. But so I was interviewing facilitators who had facilitated at least two of these councils, but most facilitators had facilitated between 5 and 10 of them. Some had facilitated between 10 and 20, and some had even more experience than that.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a pretty experienced crew of people that I was able to gather.
Cool.
And I started out by asking them what they most enjoyed about facilitating these councils and what they found most challenging. And that was just a warm-up question in each individual interview. And then after that, I would invite facilitators to choose a moment that was particularly meaningful to them in any of the councils that they had facilitated. It could be a particularly challenging moment, or it could be a particularly memorable moment in a positive way, and then to just let me know what had happened. And then I would ask a bunch of follow-up questions to help create the context of how that council had started, what had come before that particular moment, what happened afterwards, what were the outcomes of the council, etc. So I was obtaining some practice stories of a council. Not all of the ones, but each I ended up with a practice story of a particular council from each person whom I interviewed.
Sort of a mix of it all. What did you do with this information?
I wrote my dissertation on it.
Okay. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Cool.
And now,
Congratulations. Are
thank
you?
you.
Did you graduate?
I did. I am now a
Okay.
PhD.
So you're Dr. Rosa.
I am.
Nice. You know, my knee's been bothering me.
uh, yeah.
Okay, cool. So now are you hoping to apply this, or have you applied it in a local,
Oh,
like to the US,
yeah.
democracy?
There's a there's an innovations in democracy movement here in the U.S.
Mhm.
We're a little bit less advanced in that area than folks in Europe are. But for instance, there's a gentleman from Stanford, James Fishkin, who has done something he calls deliberative polls. He's done that internationally. Those are very well known. They're a slightly different process than the one in Austria because he's not helping groups get to consensus. He's just They are facilitated, but there's more like before and after opinion surveys. So the output of that process is information for the government sponsors about what would the opinion change amongst people be with regard to a particular topic if they had a chance to go into depth on it in a facilitated context and explore it with people with different perspectives. So there's many variants of these kinds of processes. And sometimes these days they're all getting called citizens' assemblies, although that's not exactly correct because that term ideally should be reserved for the larger ones that are between 50, 150 people and often last anywhere between 4 weekends to 8 weekends. And of course, you don't ever work with 100 people all at a time. They're in groups of 15 to 20 people and then coming back to plenaries and then back into small groups and like that. But there's a number of different models. There's citizen juries, there's different, there's the citizen councils that I've studied. There's different variations, of course. But
were you familiar with Listening to the City?
Listening to the City is a America Speaks project, right?
Right.
Yeah. Yep.
Carol Lukenheimer, is that what her name was?
Right? Okay. Lukensmeyer, yeah.
Lukensmeyer, thank you.
So I've never been to one of those, but I've certainly read a good deal about them, and I know people who were volunteer facilitators for several of those.
I was.
Oh, you were? Oh, great.
Yeah. And they had, thousands of people.
Yep. They were very well funded and they were able to get thousands of people. I think they were usually between 3 to 4 days. Am I right?
The one I was in, I think it was only 1 day, but maybe it was 2.
Okay.
It might have been 2.
Okay. So relatively short period of time, which is a similar thing to the councils which I studied, which are 2 days.
Mm-hmm.
But the councils are much smaller. The councils are between 15 to 30 people. Sometimes they have started to do larger ones, like say 50 people and 60 people in groups, 4 groups of 15 each, like that. But the other difference, and I don't know, I think basically different formats are useful for different purposes. I don't think that there's any one format that is the best one in all context. It really varies for what you're doing these days. What's really more often done in the field is something called sortition based groups. And so sortition means that people are chosen by public lottery. It's not just anyone who wants to show up.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is that people are attempting to approximate, if you do a poll, you want to say we have a representative sample of the larger whole so we can extrapolate from the findings from our poll to the larger whole. Now, it turns out that in order to be able to do that in a scientifically valid way, you would need a pretty large number of people. So these smaller sortition-based experiments, they're not large enough to be statistically representative. However, there's still the principle that any of you could have been chosen because we are choosing people through a public lottery, kind of like a jury system, right?
Well, kind of like Athenian democracy.
Like Athenian democracy as well. Yep.
Which was a lottery of all the available citizens. Of course, those were only the male landowners.
Yeah, exactly.
But all the available citizens, so that they would not have career politicians or have wealth influence their politics too much.
Exactly. So there's a real good argument to be made for a sortition process, and there's a lot of experimentation with that going on around the world right now.
Cool. I would love to see us convert to that in the U.S. for the national government.
There is a report by Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and they have a report that they published that is called...
Well, while you're searching for it, I'll just say that Listening to the City intentionally had a representative demographic. That was their goal. And even at the table I was at, there were people who, that were basically had no money. And there were Wall Street brokers. And each group was only like 8. So, so there was small group dialogue, even though there was such a large number of people involved. It was pretty masterful, really. I was impressed.
Yeah. Yes, I've heard really good things about it. And as you said, they did a lot of efforts to have a very broad diversity of people. Yeah, so this report that I was mentioning is called Innovative Citizen Participation and New Democratic Institutions. And that's sponsored by the International Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. It was published in 2020. But here in the United States, there's a somewhat similar report. It's not just about these kinds of councils, although these councils are mentioned in there, but there's a wonderful report called Our Common Purpose, Reinventing American Democracy for the 21st Century, and it's by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And I really like that report because it is very well researched, but at the same time, it's also very well presented. It's not overwhelming. It's not overly complicated. They distilled their recommendations down into 6 different strands, and then each strand has, I believe, 4 to 6 recommendations. So it's very well presented to be accessible and readable, and it's a great report.
Cool.
And one of their strands recommends more use of these kinds of councils here in the U.S.
I wish, and maybe if I dig enough, I can get it. But I wish I knew the structure that the State Department used in the reconstruction of Germany.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know enough about that.
Yeah, all I know is that Lewin had very carefully studied what happened in Germany after World War I, and then given advice to the State Department. But he passed away before they really implemented the Marshall Plan and the reconstruction of Germany. But they certainly did create a successful democracy out of whatever happened there. And I know that Lewin was very clear: don't go in there and force them to do it a certain way or the way we do it in the United States. You've got to engage people, even though some of the people you're engaging were guards in concentration camps and SS members. And so it was a complicated landscape.
Yes, indeed.
But anyway, that's one in my spare time I want to learn more about. It's a rare at a national scale like that to engage the citizenry around how to have a government.
I have to say, I really know very little about that. I did not realize that they had done any kind of public engagement process for reconstructing Germany after World War II. Please let me know about anything that you learn about that.
Okay, cool. How about the decision structure in these small groups in Austria? Like, do they have...
Oh, yes. That's a fascinating thing we can talk about. So part of the reason I ended up researching Austria, people say, why Austria? And it was because I have colleagues who are practitioners of dynamic facilitation, which is, I've been trained in a lot of different approaches, but that's one of the approaches I've been trained in. And that's the methodology that they use to facilitate these councils. So I was very intrigued because I've used dynamic facilitation in my work with nonprofits and small to medium-sized businesses, et cetera. And I have done a little bit of work for local government, but I did a more of a multi-stakeholder council for a local school board using dynamic facilitation. But I've not done these random selection, sortition-based coming up with recommendations on public policy issues. But after having talked a lot with practitioners there who do that work, I can definitely respond to your question. So let me start out by saying, Gil, that in the dynamic facilitation process, we start out by really, it's almost like cognitive mapping, except that we're just keeping 4 charts going. One is solutions, one is concerns, one is data, one is problem statements. But what we're doing is we're creating a space for people to purge, to empty themselves of the various initial ideas, thoughts, recommendations, concerns about others' recommendations, et cetera, that they're all walking into the room with, right? So unlike something like interest-based negotiation, which is attempting to get people to put their solutions aside temporarily so that we can define what all the shared interests are and then create a new solution based on that. It's like we want to get to a very similar place, but we do it a slightly different way. We do it by welcoming people's initial creative solutions as their best work to date with the limited data set that they've been working with, right? So we basically want to, okay, so say the theme is what to do with this open space, right? Like the one that you were talking about in your, when we started out the conversation that you were helping your dad with. Say that were the theme. Well, we want to hear from each person in the small group. What would you do with this space if it were up to you, right? And people will share their pet ideas and like that, and we're listening and reflecting and charting it up on chart paper. And then somebody else might have a very different perspective. And so we're welcoming that as well, right? And one of the things that happens when we work with a group in this way is that people start to very naturally let go of the perspectives that they had walked into the room with, or at least modify them somewhat, because they realized, oh, I hadn't thought of that concern that somebody else has brought up, or, oh, somebody else has explained why this first idea isn't going to work so well, right? Another participant. And so we're really helping to surface all of the thinking that people have already done on the topic and charting all of it. And so then people very naturally get into a second phase where they start to come up with fresh creative ideas. What if we did this, but we tweaked it that way and we combined this idea that somebody offered over here with this other twist, or changed it slightly to take this other concern into account that somebody else was sharing? So people start doing fresh thinking based on the shared information, the shared perspectives, the shared initial solutions that everybody has contributed to date.
And being heard.
They're being heard. They're being heard.
So there's no need to, there's less need or less likelihood that they'll get into a more combative.
Yeah.
Experience.
And so what happens then is at some point, so we have a very, very wide divergence phase where we're exploring all this rich territory and charting it all. And at some point, we shift into convergence mode and we ask people, out of all the different ideas that have been heard and explored, where are the ones where you felt there was most group resonance, right? So people will go through and they'll say, oh, well, at some point we were talking about solution number 5 up there on the board. And I saw a lot of nods around, because we haven't been voting, we haven't been deciding up to now. So maybe that's a candidate for convergence. And somebody else might say, well, sorry, I have some real reservations about that, and I didn't speak up at the time, but I think that, so we're like, okay, well, what's a different one? Well, maybe idea number 34 up on the charts, because people get very prolific, where it's like a brainstorm in some ways, where we're just coming up with lots and lots and lots of ideas and possibilities and thoughts. But at this point, we're kind of going back and saying, well, which ones of these do you think kind of resonated with a lot of the folks here in this room? And so people will nominate different ones, and we'll go through and we'll say, okay, but we're not trying to only come up with one. Like, we might have a series of 4 recommendations or 5 recommendations or 6 recommendations. It's as many as we can find that somebody says, well, yeah, I mean, I would like to tweak it a little bit, and then I could sign up for it. And so the facilitator says, okay, well, how would you like to tweak it? And then checks around, and then does that work for everybody else? And like that. So we end up tweaking all of the, adjusting, modifying slightly, all of the ones that are pretty close to common ground. And it was still in a creative process. And so then those become the list of recommendations.
Okay.
So that's one way to do it. I know that people have evolved the process, and
sure,
sometimes they might actually vote and say anything that receives 80% or of above is going to go on the list. There's different ways, but basically we're really looking for super majorities. We're not looking for 51-49s.
We do a multi-voting process with large groups where there's dialogue afterwards. And if there's something but we're actually trying to help them identify solutions in organizations where they are willing to lead the implementation. So that's an important piece of it. We don't really want solutions that are going to have to be handed off, except on a very small percentage of them, because the handoff tends to lead towards less likelihood of actual successful implementation, at least in our history.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's actually what I was especially curious about was, like, is there a government body that knows that solutions are being generated and that they're going to be offered these solutions? Or
yes.
Okay, so it's not a surprise.
No, it's not. Well, so again, I can't speak for the whole field because I've studied, a tiny corner of it in Austria. But in Austria, the organizers of these processes are very aware that there needs to be a lot of buy-in from the sponsoring governmental organization, because otherwise you have a group of people who come up with something and then they feel like their recommendations haven't been heard. You end up in a worse position than before, not a better one, right? Instead of increasing morale and increasing trust in government, you are actually decreasing it. So there's a lot of advance work that is done with the governmental sponsors. Now, they can't just promise that they're going to implement everything, because that would be like signing a blank check.
Of course.
You don't know what people are going to recommend. But the commitment is to implement as much as you can. And for anything that you're not able to implement, explain why that is.
Okay, cool. That's great. That sounds like a good structure.
Yeah.
And I don't know how, with that overall process, you could avoid the handoff portion of it.
I mean, I have a couple of things to say about that, because it's a really good question, Gil. So one is that the design of the Vorarlberg Bürgerräte is really top-notch in that when the council has finished doing their work and comes up with their recommendation, part of the design is that they share their findings at a large public open gathering. So the council itself is sortition-based. It's not open to anybody who wants to come. It's people who have been chosen by public lottery. Again, analogous to a jury. You don't just show up one day and say, oh, I want to be part of this jury. You need to have gotten your little invitation letter in the mail saying you've been chosen. But that's just for the council itself. For this, they call it a burger cafe, and and they do them based on World Cafe principles. For this public meeting where the council is going to report out at the burger cafe, everybody is invited. And so people show up. There's an initial presentation by the council where they're talking about the process of coming to their recommendations and what their recommendations are. And then everyone in the room is at small tables, World Cafe style, talking about, well, what resonated for you? And then 20 minutes, and then you shift to another small table. And maybe the second question is, what did they leave out? Or what would you add to this, right? Or what concerns do you have? And so people are in small groups. And then after there's been 2 or 3 rounds of this World Cafe style small group conversation, then the facilitator opens it up to a whole large group conversation, inviting people to report out. What have you been hearing at your small tables? What has stayed with you? What was most intriguing or surprising? And so you have a whole group conversation amongst all of the people who have shown up there. And the meeting sponsors are always there for this. And they're the ones who open the meeting, introduce the council, and then they listen. So they get a chance right there and then to begin getting feedback about how are the recommendations of the small microcosm council going to go over with a much larger group that is an open public meeting, but a participatory one.
Cool.
And then at that meeting, there is something that is formalized, that is the responders group. Now, the organizers have been thinking about the responders group from the beginning, but at this burger cafe, they will invite, if there's somebody from the council or somebody from the cafe or both who want to join this group of people who are going to be meeting on a monthly basis, whose main purpose is to track what's happening to these recommendations as they move through the bowels of the bureaucracy.
Cool.
And so they get to monitor and report at the end of 6 months what happened.
If they're motivated to do so. So that's good.
No. They need to. I mean, that's their mandate.
They only join that if they are motivated.
Oh, yes. There's someone from the council, someone from the cafe, and the rest of the folks are people from the different nonprofits or government departments that will need to be implementing these recommendations.
Right. What I really meant by motivation is if they really care, they can be in that small group to help monitor. And
Absolutely. So, but it's so important that you have a small group like that because, people in government are super busy and they're tracking lots of different stuff. And it's really easy for things to get lost between the cracks. And so you need to have someone who is following the recommendations, seeing what's getting implemented, what's not, why, and coordinating that whole process of closing the feedback loop and being able to report back to people what happened after all that work that you did.
That makes sense. And as the people in the country get used to the structure, there's probably more likelihood that the people who are inheriting the task of implementing will be less stressed when they are given a new direction. I wonder, just thinking out loud as I listen to this, if and maybe it's already happening, if the people that are in those government agencies couldn't be invited into the process early.
Oh, yeah. There's definitely a lot of outreach by the organizers to those people who are in the government agencies. And
it can't be all of them, of course, but
and they may have already chosen who from the government agency is going to be part of the follow-up team, right? Before the council has even done their work. They don't know what the recommendations are, but they know that if we have a council on transportation, the Department of Transportation is going to need to track what we're doing with those recommendations. So
Sure.
they're prepared ahead of time to be receiving input and looking at it and thinking about how they can best implement it and tracking what the response is, for sure.
Cool. Okay, well, that sounds like a worthy thing to do a dissertation on.
Thanks. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to say, and this is slightly different from this particular application of coming up with recommendations. One of the things I learned, there's this whole field called the diffusion of innovation. And so people create something and then, it evolves and other people create other things based on it, et cetera. So in Austria, these councils are still being used for their original purpose, which is to come up with these recommendations for government. But they've also, some people have, innovated and come up with a new application, which is that they have in Austria, they have this thing called Local Agenda 21, which was started. I don't know enough about it, actually. I'm still in the process of researching it. But it came out of one of the UN sustainability meetings, maybe in 2014. I'm not sure about that, but it's been around for a while, where the purpose was, let's see if we can invite local governments to, let's not just wait for leadership from countries for the sustainability goals. Let's see if we can invite local governments to figure out how they can meet our sustainability goals. And at that point, as I said, I don't have the exact date. Don't quote me on this, but say it was 2014. It's like, oh, we'll meet these goals by 2021. Well, now we're looking back at 2021, right? Because it's 2024. But at the time, it was called Local Agenda 21, and it had to do with meeting these sustainability goals. And so what they decided is that the people responsible for organizing these community engagement processes for sustainability, what they decided is that they didn't just want the same regular folks showing up who are always the ones who become involved in these kinds of things. So they wanted to start, and this is in Austria, any local Agenda 21 project, if the local organizers were open to it. They wanted to give them an incentive. So if you want to start with a citizens council of randomly chosen people from your town or your municipality or your region for this project, we will give you extra funds so that you can do that. Cool. And so they started to do that. Various of the sustainability organizers started to use this council process, sortition-based, to involve a broader spectrum of people in an original weekend where they would take on sustainability topics. But in this case, the recommendations don't go to somebody else. These recommendations become the focus that this group is going to continue to organize around. And it's community members, local business owners,
It's local implementation.
Local multi-stakeholder implementation of these sustainability goals. So it's not like, here, government, you do this. It's like, what can we do to meet this goal? And one of the things that some of the facilitators that I interviewed with told me is that when they do one of these councils for the purpose of Local Agenda 21 projects, at the end of the 2-day council, they ask people, they say, okay, well, now that we have a set of things that we feel are important to work on, who here would like to take part in the steering committee of the larger year-long project that it's going to take to begin to implement these goals? And it's a very different order of commitment than for the weekend, because people have just signed up for a 2-day thing. At the end of the 2-day thing, they're being invited to take part in something that's, at least a monthly meeting over the course of a year, and a really high number of them sign up. So that's an indicator for them of how successful this is, that people really want to continue.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, we only have a few minutes left, and we have perhaps not even finished the first topic. So I'm glad we explored it, because there's a lot there. That's great work and great hope for humanity, that people can figure out how to listen to each other and organize positive action, and so on. I'm listening and thinking of calling this nurturing democracy or nurturing democratic processes. Is that?
Well, yeah. I've written a couple articles called "Facilitating Democracy"
Uh-huh.
because one of the interesting things, I just studied in depth the folks in Austria, but I've done a lot of reading about democratic innovations in this mini public sortition based format in a lot of other countries as well. And even though the facilitation processes that they use differ, et cetera, the commonality is that they're always facilitated. And it stands to reason, because people really don't like getting into arguments about public issues, right? And a very frequently encountered comment across a lot of the varieties of these processes is people afterwards say, wow, I really appreciated the opportunity to talk about these issues in a supportive context where everyone was listening to each other.
Nice. I mean, I get that with the work I'm doing on racism.
Yeah.
And people expect it's going to be a fight, and they're afraid. And so facilitating democracy, that would
facilitating democracy. Absolutely. Yes.
Cool. So I think that's it. That's what I'll call this. And so, what do you do now that you're done with your dissertation? How do you spend your time?
Well, I am here at the Ash Center at the Harvard Kennedy School doing a year-long democracy visiting fellowship. And my goal has been to take my very long and rambling dissertation and condense it into a few publishable articles. I have one that I've submitted so far and a couple of others that are in progress. And so I audited a couple of courses. I audited a lovely course taught by Professor Rebecca Henderson on the climate crisis, looked at from an interdisciplinary perspective. And I audited another wonderful course on the social psychology of moral conflicts and how we can find ways through them. It was taught by another wonderful professor, Jeffrey Sohl, who is a lawyer and also teaches at the Divinity School, Harvard Divinity School. So he teaches a course for lawyers on the nuts and bolts of working with moral conflicts. And this course that I was taking was more for faith-based social change agents on understanding the underlying kind of dimensions of moral conflicts.
Nice.
So, yeah.
So I have various reasons to come to Boston. And so if I come to Boston, perhaps I'll get to meet you.
That would be great. In mid-August, I'm going to be taking off for Germany. I have a 9-month fellowship there.
Wow. Whereabouts?
Research Institute for Sustainability, which is in Potsdam.
Wow.
Which is about an hour outside of Berlin.
Yeah, I've been to Potsdam.
Oh, you've been to Potsdam. Great. Well, we have to continue that conversation at some point.
Well, Potsdam is wonderful. I mean, it's mostly palaces. It's a beautiful town all around the palaces also, but Frederick the Great built his palace there. But you're even closer to Berlin than an hour. I think it's shorter than that.
So. Well, I've never been. I do hear it's beautiful, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, hopefully I'll get back sometime during that period then.
Yeah.
But there's a lot to explore there in Boston. in terms of Lewin's roots that I still am trying to dig
Oh,
into. So,
okay. Well, yeah, let's definitely figure out when and where to connect in person, Gil. And thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
thank you, Rosa. It's a pleasure. And so, if people want to get a hold of you, I mean, they can contact me, but is there anything else you want to say?
Well, I do want to share my website because I have a lot of resources on there. It's
Cool.
www.diapraxis, that's DIAPRAXIS, diapraxis.net.
Okay.
And so,
And I
yeah.
have that written down in case anyone needs me to tell them about it. Diapraxis.net. Lovely. I'll take a look myself.
Great. Yeah, and in closing, I just want to say that I really admire the work that you do, Gil, because I think that Lewin's work is very much needed in this day and age, and especially his work on democratic leadership and what it means, right? Because as I've heard you talk about it in other times, there's a misunderstanding that democratic leadership is just laissez-faire, and the reality is that we need much more than that. We need, I don't know, I tend to think of it as facilitative leadership, but same thing. We need leadership that is all about getting input from people and then being able to make decisions and follow through on things, but in a participatory way.
I mostly agree with that.
Yeah. Okay.
And then there is what I think is similar here as to Germany prior to the election of Hitler.
Right.
There is the danger in a democracy of only valuing rights and participatoriness and so on could be seen that way. And I believe there also has to be, like Lewin said, an intolerance of, he said, don't tolerate the intolerant.
Uh-huh.
If you have people in your culture who are using democratic rights like freedom of speech in order to undermine democracy, then you need to stop that. Whether it means putting them in jail or whatever it takes, you have to have a some kind of a line about how do you be a member of a democracy, and if you are instead working against it, how do we cope with that?
That's a very big question. I think we should come back for another podcast on that.
Yeah, because it's certainly a live and question in the United States right now, as I'm sure you agree.
And in other parts of the world as well.
Yep.
I was just actually reading something about Gregory Bateson, and who was very concerned about this same issue, that if you fight against authoritarians, it makes them stronger, and if you ignore them, it makes them stronger. So how do you respond to the threat of authoritarianism in a way that is effective?
Yep. You
And
have to
that's
invite as many. You have to. I mean, for one, we've never really decided on what is really the direction of this particular country. Yeah, there's always been this tolerance of inequality and racism, for instance. And so we have to decide that we really are a country that stands for democratic values and not go support dictators someplace else. I mean, we've always been confused as far as I can tell from our history, even at the beginning. So, but anyway, yes, that is perhaps a story for another day.
Well, I think part of the issue is that I just want to bring the word trauma in here as well, because I think
Mm-hmm.
that we have a situation where there's been so much trauma around misuse of leadership, abuse of leadership that
Sure.
then there's a lot of people who become very allergic to the word, right? And who are like, oh, we don't need any leaders, or let's just have a perfectly flat organization.
Yep.
And in reality, as it is a larger conversation. In reality, I think we can have organizations that are more flat, and I still think that there are coordinating functions that are really important, as I believe that you do as well. So it's
Yep.
like,
Leadership.
let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, right?
Right. We started
So,
this country by overthrowing an authoritarian leader,
mm-hmm,
at least the United States portion of the country.
yep,
And at the same time, we practice authoritarianism.
right,
So it's a strange mix that
yeah,
hasn't quite resolved itself. Hopefully it will
right.
for the better. Last question. Do you know Claudia Lachault or Peter Snur?
Names are not ringing a bell right now.
Okay, two Austrians that were our facilitators that were in a
Ah,
tea group I led in Berlin 2 years ago. So I was just
oh,
curious
wonderful.
if they might
Okay.
be on your list, but
Well, so just this thing about tea groups, right? It's like we had this conversation before. You and your father and your brother lead tea groups in a significantly different way
a lot of structure.
than what?
A lot of structure.
A lot of structure that ends up allowing you to do really, really, really good work in the sense of that you can go into an organization and do a tea group, and that's not something you can do with the regular tea group model that is, in a way, much more of a free for all and not so emotionally safe for participants, right?
Yep.
And yet they're both called tea group, and so it's a similar process in a way in terms of the difference between dynamic facilitation and other forms of facilitation. We have a lot of room for people to participate and say whatever they want to say, but we also have a lot of structure. Participants speak to the facilitator, not to each other. The facilitator reflects back and charts what they're saying. So if you're exploring a very controversial topic in depth, it creates a lot of safety because it's like people speaking into the fire. If you're all sitting around a campfire and people are speaking into the fire, it's very different than if somebody is coming at somebody and pointing their fingers in their face, etc. People don't get as triggered. People are able to hear different perspectives much more deeply because they're overhearing them. And so it's a similar kind of thing in that sometimes more structure provides greater psychological safety and allows you to do things that aren't so easily done or take a lot longer with
Sure.
other processes, right? So, in the regular tea group, I know that after 4 or 5 days, it's very often the case, or 2 or 3 days at any rate, to reach a more kumbaya state where people aren't being in each other's face, shall we say? But it can be very useful if you can have a harmonious process that goes deep and that is rich and full of learning in a shorter period of time without having to go through all that deeply uncomfortable stuff. I'm not saying that people should always be perfectly comfortable at all, but I think that there's, a degree of psychological safety that's important to ensure when you're doing a tea group with an organization, and or if, say, you were doing a tea group in a public engagement context. Now,
Yeah. Now,
I would much, go ahead.
one thing I think you know this, or at least I've said it, is that the T groups we're leading are the T just stands for training.
Right.
That's what it did stand for, and I think are closer to Lewin's T groups
Yes.
than
Yeah.
what became the more regular way of doing it, which
Yeah.
was less structured, more ambiguity.
Yep. And,
But
and more anxiety, because the more ambiguity you have, the more interpersonal anxiety you have.
there's, that I don't know for sure because there's a fair amount of anxiety in the T groups the way we run them. And then there's conflict, but the people have models and help about how to manage their emotions and
Yes.
manage their interactions. And so we're not in any way wanting them to avoid their conflicts.
Right.
So the conflicts are sort of steady through the whole process, a little messier at first, but when people differ, when they recognize they're differing, they actually acknowledge it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. It's not about doing away with conflict. It's just about offering enough structure that people can deal with it productively, right?
right,
So,
right. And then that's the same way I do the diversity work, then, is to have them have those skills and then talk to each other. So it's a little different. There's, it's, and of course, structure that people start to trust creates some psychological safety, whether it's talking to the facilitator or talking to each other. And
yeah.
you have to have skill training first if you're going to just have people talk to each other about difficult issues.
Right, right, right.
So,
So we go about it slightly different ways, but the point being that that there's different ways to go about it.
that's
And
right. And you're trying
right,
to, well, at least the processes that you're studying and helping to bring into the public are processes that help a group of strangers quickly help create some mutual policy
yep,
suggestions. And so that's great. That's great.
yep,
Not easy.
yeah. And people find it so meaningful. That's the interesting thing for me, and not just in Austria. In all of these processes, people really enjoy or appreciate or find meaning in the work of figuring out, how do we want our world to be? How do we want our country to be? How do we want our town to be? And even though they're grappling with these uh, different perspectives, if it is a psychologically safe space where each person is being heard and treated with respect, it's not that it's always easy, but it's people find it worthwhile.
That makes
And
sense. People want to
mhm,
influence.
yes, people
That,
want to influence. Absolutely.
and it's frustrating if you feel like you have no influence.
Yeah. And it's frustrating if you feel that you have to wade into a battlefield in order to be heard.
Sure.
For me, that's the takeaway of any and all forms of deliberative mini publics or
Hmm.
participatory public engagement processes, is that with enough structure so that everybody can be heard, there is such value that people find in it.
Wanting to be heard and not having a voice is certainly like the history of women for the last 2,000 years. It's just a meaningful thing to be doing, figuring out how to help everyone have a voice.
Indeed.
Well, look, Rosa, again, this has been lovely. I think this time we'll really stop.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks again, Gil. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, well, I really appreciate it. I appreciate all you who have been listening, and that's a wrap. Take care. Hey, I appreciate you listening. This, again, is Gil Crosby, and I want you to take advantage of what's available to you. I have many free materials. I am happy to talk to people about their situations, especially if you're trying to create change, either social change or organization change. We have frequent workshops that are available, T group workshops. If you have never been in a T group with us, then don't miss it in your life. It's many people have said to me, of all the trainings I've ever received, I got this one 30 years ago, and it's the only one that stuck with me. You're learning from your actual interactions with the other participants and with the faculty. The faculty are walking the same talk that they're teaching of behavioral skills. It's a training workshop. That's what the T stands for. This is done in the spirit of the creation of T groups by Kurt Lewin and his associates. It's for groups, it's for teams. That's how it was originally designed. It is a opportunity to learn about theory and put it directly into practice. Again, the original design, you learn things and then you put them into practice. It was not just all ambiguity, which is how some T groups, most are led today, where the faculty hardly says anything. That's not how this is designed. So join us for that. There's always workshops. There's the Leadership Institute of Seattle, which has certificate programs, a two-year program where you will learn from T groups and learn how to do all the organization development work that my father designed, most of it, and I continue that practice alongside my brother Chris and many other associates. So don't be a stranger. There's a lot going on. It's always changing. So be in touch, and it's on the website, crosbyod.com. I look forward to working with you in your organization or as you pursue things like reducing gun violence and decreasing racism in our society. Whatever your goals are, the social science of Kurt Lewin guides how to achieve those goals in a reliable way. And so that's what I apply and practice every day and invite you to.